you're listening to Late Night Tales.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Brewster. I'm the author of all the Late Night Tales sleeve notes, and in between that, I'm a writer, DJ, and Grimsby town supporter. I've got a panel with me this evening who are going to dissect various subjects relating to Late Night Tales and music and curation. On my right, I've got Ansel Neckles, who's from the Let's Be Brief cultural journal. Next to him is Robin Murray, who's the deputy editor of Clash magazine. And on my far right is Robert Raths, who runs the Erased Tapes record label. Do you want to say hi?
How you doing? You all right?
Hello.
Hey.
Okay, so we're going to talk about curating and what curating means in a world of digital music and all of that kind of stuff. So I sort of wanted to ask, first of all, each in turn, what they view as curation and how important it is in their world. So, Ansel, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. For me, curation is consideration, I think, as opposed to saturation. We run a cultural journal, and it is a part of our business model as a creative agency. And that means that we can't always be committed to every single piece of kind of content that flies through our doorway or flies through our letterbox. But what we do have to do is consider the nature of the communications and the nature of the content that we feature on Let's Be Brief, because just to let you know, we're kind of, as a cultural journal, we're very much geared towards dissecting communication and the communications mix and the implications of communication. And for us, that means taking a more thorough view of what we feature, because you can always try and be immediate, but then what is now will often always be yesterday's news. But to curate something will be to think about how we view that work in the future, what that means tomorrow, how it implies upon our viewpoint on the world tomorrow. So curation is about just considering how people think and giving people credit for their intelligence, I think, and sometimes less being more, often being a good model for me.
Okay, Robin?
In publishing, curation for me is bringing together disparate elements to create a whole. I think if you look at Clash, if you look at any magazine, when you pull it down off the shelf, it's a singular object. It's got an identity that you can latch onto. But that identity is formed from this multiplicity of identities, these many narratives that come together. And that has to be chosen, that has to be brought together, and it can be brought together in unexpected ways. It can clash, it can complement. But curation for me is absolutely vital in what I do on day-to-day, and it's what I look for in any aspect of creativity, whether it's music or visual arts or anything.
Robert?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I really like the word curator. To me, it speaks to mind just simple ideas in even like a family, like someone like a teacher or like an older brother, someone who has an idea of what could be interesting to bring to the table on top of the already existing. It's kind of like a risk taker, I think. A curator is someone who sort of goes like, okay, we could do the same as usual, but we could also like open up and introduce new ideas. So yeah, I quite like the idea that it's more like a, like a sharing and sort of inspiring each other. Yeah.
What is it, do you think, that a curator actually does?
Well, like a curator is someone who asks themselves the question, what would I like to experience beyond the usual? Also, like, mentioned earlier, something to look forward to, something that is a little bit, puts things in a different context. A curator is something like that, I would say.
Okay, Robin, what do you think a curator actually does in between making cups of tea?
Yeah, tea is all important. I think as Robert said there, context is everything. I think a curator is someone who picks up these existing pathways and throws them together in order to create something that is new, or at least suggests where the new can come from.
Ansel?
I'm particularly keen to take the word curator and the idea of curation away from what could be considered quite a bit of a wanky space. Can we say that? We said it, it's too late. Because we look at it often in the terms of fine art and these very niche kind of artistic endeavors. But for me, a curator is somebody who understands the power of narrative and somebody who understands what not only is implied, but what can be taken away potentially from an engagement with a piece of work or a body of work. And somebody that gives an audience credit for their own intelligence to be able to then interpret a body of work. So for me, curation is just about the careful construction of narrative, but also often, I suppose, how best to phrase it? Storytelling often means a dumbing down of information. And for me, the best curators, the best storytellers recognize that as individuals trying to go places and to, I suppose, dissect our lives through our connection with communication and through art and through culture, that there's a certain level of responsibility in that process of that filtering and editing of work.
Do you think, you say there's an element of dumbing down, do you think that's a consequence of the kind of last 20 years of the rise of digital technology? Because I don't think 20 years ago someone would have said that storytelling is necessarily a dumbed down activity, but we seem to live in kind of a sped up world, and where people, for example, if you're reading a piece on the internet, it can't be too long because people's attention span is very low, and I'm wondering if that you think that's a consequence of what's happened in technology.
That's a consequence of the culture of immediacy and saturation. I talked about curation versus saturation. We did a talk today with Fred Deakin, founder of Airside, and he talked about our obsession with screens and how many business models, i.e. internet-based models, or folks just invested in the constant creation or presentation of content, are primarily obsessed with the idea of us being connected continually to a screen, which doesn't mean any relation to quality of content, but what it just means is any form of content that keeps you looking at the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, which is how the Daily Mail works as an interesting business model. They have occasionally an article of some note and then a right-hand column which is essentially about keeping you there till the end of time. You could call that curation, but ultimately it's saturation, and with a view to keeping you engaged but continually disengaged at the same time, which is somewhat of a paradox, but it's a really strange place. Dumbing down in of itself, when I relate to storytelling, no, storytelling and the idea of dumbing stuff down, it depends on the nature of the story, I guess. So I use dumbing down because the immediacy of the culture that we live in means that we never really give too much time to a particular subject, which is why news in of itself becomes yesterday's news very quickly. Analysis requires a further level of investigation, which you could consider a commitment of the curator, but most people see that as too much hard work, I would say.
But I mean, it is interesting, but I do think it's kind of a consequence of the way that we use the internet, though, and this is relevant not just to the Daily Mail or to BuzzFeed, but to music and everything else. My wall on Facebook is plastered with people posting links to YouTube of different bands and different songs, and it becomes quite bewildering trying to make sense of it all. I mean, do you get this feeling when you just in your ordinary daily life of trying to process all of this information? I'll go over to Robert for this first. Do Do you find it slightly like you're drowning occasionally when you're kind of trying to work and there's all this stuff being thrown at you?
Yeah, certainly. Actually, Robin and myself just spoke about it, how things are changing in this digital age, and what the future is for physical records as well as magazines. And I can only speak for myself. I think that's the thing, being a curator, I don't think it's something that you should think about too much, because in the end, people sort of trust you, but it's not like a trust that you should abuse. You know, it's not something like you mentioned earlier, like something that is like a media to kind of keep a constant flow of visitors, users, consumers. Essentially, it's more like, sometimes I love being completely wrong. You know, I love making that decision and risking a little bit, and then you have those few people that kind of are with you, versus like a majority of people who kind of go like, "What's this all about? That was a really bad idea." But I mean, what is bad and what is good? Like, I mean, in this digital age, like you said, like things are in a constant flow, and you can, you know, the person that sits at home makes a decision. It's not like back in the days where you had to go to the record shop or like a newsstand to pick up a certain magazine. Like, there's a lot of effort actually involved in and just digesting new bits of information, music, arts. Whereas nowadays you kind of get bombarded as soon as you just enter the internet. You know, there's something happening everywhere all the time. And I'm kind of sick of it. I mean, a lot of people are sick of it. It's something that within the label we talk about most of the time. It's like, when did you last actually switch off? You know, like, how can we go on a holiday? Not just a holiday like far, far away, just within, you know, within London, within our space. And it's interesting, we actually came to the conclusion that at the current rate, it would be most effective if all of the artists, including myself, just set a date in the diary for everyone where we just put like a black page on the internet and say, you know, currently not available. That will actually be the only way for us to just switch off, all of us, you know. And otherwise there's always something happening, there's always something new, and I think that's kind of scary.
Robin?
I thrive on the new, to be honest. I'm not turning my computer off for anyone. Yeah, the negatives of the digital age, I think, have been stated already, and I definitely agree with them. There's too much music being made. There's not enough filters. But I would say is that just makes the role of the curator ever more vital. I think people need these kind of gateways, these gatekeepers. I think people respond to a consistency of voice. I think people learn to trust certain DJs, certain presenters, certain sites, certain publications. They return to these things, and you know, I don't trust the Daily Mail, but it works for them. But I think there's better examples we can definitely choose that, you know, demonstrate the validity of the digital argument.
Ansel?
I think the most exciting possibility for me that the digital realm offers is the fact that the idea of the curator isn't something we necessarily need to bestow upon somebody else as a responsibility. We have the opportunity to curate our own narratives and to speak to audiences that we understand implicitly. What we choose to populate those spaces with will depend upon how much of a responsibility we place upon our ability to share and to disseminate content and information, and what that actually means. What do we do with a 140-word Twitter tweet, or whatever you want to call it? How much of that we disseminate, how much of ourselves we give away, how much time we take to learn as opposed to simply talk out into the ether. So it's balancing productivity, I guess, with the requirement to learn from the human experience, which essentially is just comes back to the storytelling narrative, it comes back to news, it comes back to what's current, but it comes back to a vision of what the future's going to look like based on the actions that we take on a daily basis.
Okay. I want to talk a little more specifically about music and how we process music and how we deal with music now. I'm a lot older than you lot, and when
No.
I'm afraid so. When I was a kid, I lived 70 miles from the nearest record store, and the only way to buy records was either to buy them by mail order from there was quite a good shop in Manchester called, I forget the name now, and there was one in Wales called Cobb Records, but I used to hitchhike to Selector Disc in Nottingham and buy records from there and then hitchhike back. Nowadays, you get up in the morning and literally you flip up the lid of your laptop and you're assaulted by new music in your inbox, new music on Twitter, new music on Facebook, and obviously what Late Night Tales does, and does very well, is to kind of offer the opportunity of curation to specific people who have a special interest in music, one style of music. And I'm just wondering how each of you deals with the process of music and how you find the music that you love when you're faced with this kind of barrage of music. Is it your friends that recommend things, or is it just your own discoveries, or how do you find music? Ansel, do you want to start? Yeah.
I think in the days of analog, the going to the record shop, the searching through boxes and boxes of music, that required a commitment, the time spent to search for and eke out the stuff that's going to work for you, and to enjoy the idea of the surprise. And then there's the conversations you had with your friends at college in the cafeteria about what you were all listening to, and challenging each other to know every single word of every single song that you loved, and trying to be the smartest Alec in the group. And I suppose we're now kind of still doing that in the digital realm. But for me, how I discover music is through that same inquisitive nature, but at the same time, I just let music talk to me, which might sound like a seance kind of statement, but essentially there's so much of it, and I listen to music and I gauge from it whether it matters to the person actually making the music themselves, because often you can tell when somebody's just putting out a piece of product, or whether somebody actually cares about the piece of music that they've made. And sometimes me liking a piece of music doesn't necessarily mean me loving a piece of music. It can often mean me appreciating the reasons why it was made. And I've got to that point in my life where it's not just so much about my own personal tastes, but me recognizing, i.e., this music or piece of music is a relevant cultural piece of piece of communication that is for the benefit of wider society. And that might sound like, well, you're only making music, but if you look at the idea of Joy Division and New Order and what these guys meant and what they were making and the kind of statements they were trying to make, yes, it was about music that they believed in, but it was about serving a wider community that they understood, and as a result there was an inherent kind of longevity in the music they created. And you can feel that. You don't need to be a brainiac or a muso to get that if you care about the human condition.
Okay, Robert?
Yeah, I have to agree. Like, obviously, it comes without saying that without the digital age, like, for instance, erase tapes wouldn't exist. You know, it's like one of those things where you kind of like, you grow up in that. Well, it's not even a generation. I think it's just one of those things that happens to you, and you kind of use them the best you can. And but it does get to a point where obviously you're kind of slowly spending more time on things that are real, you know, and I personally like it when I go to a record shop and I don't have all the time in the world and I don't have all the records in front of me. It's not like Spotify, it's something curated, you know, by someone who sometimes put like, I don't know, 30, 40 years into that curation. So instantly you're not at home, you're not just sitting in front of some laptop or in some cafe or something. You're actually in an environment that you instantly respect. And within that you behave differently and you're actually open for ideas. And sometimes they already put out on displays. But sometimes it's simply a guy kind of, knocking you to the side and going like, nah, I would listen to that. If you're into that, you might like that, or just get out of here. You're in a complete different place, And then actually that might really kind of create like a drive to kind of wanting to learn more about that type of music. Live shows as well. Like live music is a very different thing. Like in a way, I'm very thankful that in our case the label was built digitally, and all that communication in the first years happened through email. There was even artists on the label that I hadn't met until a year later. Nowadays I look back and I go like, how crazy, like it could have gone terribly wrong, and we could have met and just shouted at each other, and I think it's just a little bit of both is healthy, like there's a lot of good things about the internet, but like you said, there's so much bombardment that sometimes it's also good to just drive into a little town, go to the one record shop you can find, and be open for other ideas by people who can physically kind of point you in a different direction. That's how I feel about it.
Robin?
I actually grew up in a very remote town in the Scottish Highlands, so for me the internet was an amazing thing, because it meant I didn't have to look at sheep all day every day. I've always been very open to whatever influence I can get, so personally speaking, the digital age is just a dream come true that you can have all these influences. To pick Robert up on the point that he mentioned in terms of record shops, it is great to slow things down every now and again. It is great to enter a very defined space that you're only going to get maybe 1,000 45s and 1,000 albums available, as opposed to iTunes, where it's presumably infinite, or at least a number very close to infinity. I'm a very big Northern Soul fan as well, and that is a scene which enshrines the physical document. So you can't really rock on up to a Northern Soul night and play off CDJs. You have to really have the vinyl, and the only way you're going to get that knowledge is from speaking to people. And as Robert mentioned there, peer-to-peer sharing, and as Ansel says as well, peer-to-peer sharing is vital. And for me, really what social media does is just make that very explicit. It's there on your screen, you can retweet people's opinions, and that's exactly the same as, passing on someone's opinions. And I spoke to Robert Raths the other day, and he made a very insightful point. I think it's very much the same as that. So, I can only echo that the best of both worlds really is where we should be getting our opinions from, I think.
One of the most amazing things about the internet for me was discovering that not all great music was made by Western artists. And I think before the advent of the internet, I had no idea that people in Turkey were making funk records, and people in Russia were making disco records, and people in Indonesia were making psychedelic records. And it's been a real revelation to see these compilations coming out on labels like Soundway and so on. And I'm just wondering if any of you guys individually have discovered some amazing thing because of the internet that previously had remained hidden.
I've discovered a lot on the internet. The internet's an amazing place. It's incredible when you speak to artists about where they get their tunes from. There's a lot of DJs who I've spoken to. I remember speaking to Jack Master, and I was like, where do you get your tunes from? And he just said YouTube. Because when it comes up at the end, you have this algorithm that will throw up similar things. Sometimes it will be disjointed, sometimes you can spend an entire day on YouTube just burrowing through and finding various scenes. I remember speaking to Optimo, also from Glasgow, notorious crate diggers who have an enormous vinyl collection. But they got into South American disco and have been playing it for the past 10 years purely because of the internet. They never would have known it existed. There's an entire scene that was remote to them, given that they live in Glasgow, not South America. But they discovered it from there.
Similar
so
climate, obviously.
Very similar. A lot of rain, trees. The impact it's had has been incredible in terms of diversifying. When you look at a DJ like Ben UFO and the way he can spin things together, it's absolutely at the core, I think, of the way that people assimilate music these days.
Ansel?
There used to be a site that I used to go to quite regularly called Dusty Groove. I think it was West Coast.
Chicago,
there you go, Chicago-based web platform, and it was really a space of love and obsession, and it was not just a catalogue of music, it was an insight into music, and it was a review of music by people who clearly loved music, not just with a view to critiquing and saying something's good or bad, but people that really wanted to celebrate the best of music. And I felt as a result of that kind of sincerity and that desire that there was so much I could learn from those reviews that enabled me to take steps into other areas that I had otherwise not really known about or discovered previously. So it was kind of a space where you kind of trusted the opinions of people who weren't name brand music reviewers or anything of that nature. It was just a space where music was celebrated, and as a result you were able to take the plunge and just, for me, put my money where my mouth was and match fund that kind of obsession. So that was an interesting space for me, and to have this community in Chicago connecting with me in London and me just buying shitloads of music from them just because I loved the perspective they had on music was just brilliant for me.
Robert?
Yeah, no, certainly it's, speaking of press, actually, you know, I guess before starting a label, I never really thought much about music press. Obviously I would read it, but I never thought about the background and where those people come from who spend so much time like writing those crazy articles as if they're on dope or something. So like nowadays it's actually quite easy to find that person. Like it's usually someone on Twitter who posts like the review before it even goes online, or straight after he goes, I wrote this, you know, and you're kind of like, hey, that's this kid that we saw like 2 years ago and he was like 16 or something, you know, or like he's this guy from Ireland who's like, you know, has a brother and they run this amazing like blog, and they paint pictures of the artist and send it in frames. You know, like stuff that you after a while just really starting to appreciate. There's like real characters, which in the past I don't think I would have gotten to that point thinking about that person that much, that I would actually really enjoy meeting them at concerts or just knowing they are out there, you know. Even if it's someone who completely disagrees, you know, someone at, I don't know, Pitchfork who writes something and it creates, I love it actually when there's like a really bad review, but it creates this sort of like, people are talking about it. And there's no such thing as bad, you know, there's no bad press, and people say that all the time, but it's actually, when that happens and there's like a community and people coming together and going like, oh man, that's like, I totally disagree, and there's like hundreds of them, then even someone like working at Pitchfork really gets like, you know, sort of, whoa, you know, maybe I should have listened to this record a little bit more, maybe that's just my opinion, I listened to it enough, I don't know, it doesn't really matter, there's a dialogue. And I think that's a nice thing about the digital age, because in the past it was more like just someone speaking at you, whereas nowadays you can speak back and you can come up with ideas, and someone who's just running a blog can become the next magazine, you know, and the other way around.